Hello, this is the RPG Crawler, and it is time, once again, for another product review. This time, I'm taking a look at another D20-derived RPG, Sacrifice, an Incense and Iron RPG, from Black Oath Entertainment, who were kind enough to provide me with this review PDF. Sacrifice is an OSR-style system with some more modern elements, heavily inspired by things like the manga Berserk. As such, it has a built-in setting that evokes the general tone and feel of post-eclipse Midland, although is different enough in its details, layout, and peoples that it does feel like its own thing. Available as a PDF, the book clocks in at under 90 pages, including what appears to be a muted color cover. Interior layout is a black and white, largely two-column affair, with many inline tables and occasional inline artwork. The inline art is all black and white with a mix of individual item illustrations and proper scene setting ones. It's all done by a single illustrator, giving a proper, very cohesive feel to all of its selections, despite the fact that a couple are done in slightly different styles. Technically speaking, Sacrifice is well written and well edited. The text and rules explanations flow well without unnecessary complications, and only a very careful read-through found any sort of usual copy errors that one often finds in these independent offerings, and the few I did find are immaterial to the actual structure and understanding of the rules. The organization of the rules are straightforward and easily navigable, although I strongly suspect that's largely due to the brevity of the work as a whole. On towards the actual contents, Sacrifice is broken up into 4 major sections, with a few subsections in each one. The Basics presents character creation and covers characters, abilities, and then skills and feats, before wrapping up with finishing details and gear purchase. The second section, Rules, presents the rest of the system rules, starting with combat, going on through fatigue, and then touching on travel procedures, corruption you can accrue during adventures, and how you can gain experience points. The third section is where the setting itself is described. The world contains subsections on the various factions, the Kingdom of Bavaria, the Cadenor Dominion, and the Church of the Burning Light, as well as the demonic threat. There's history on the 100 Years' War, with details on the area that the default setting takes place in, No Man's Land. There's also a segment on determining events each week, as well as treasure. The final main section is simply a bestiary, detailing the demonic apostles, beasts, humans, and monsters. In more detail, the basics section starts out with an introduction to Sacrifice, explaining it as a D20 system that's compatible with both retro clones and some modern material, and goes into the central idea. You play as a human who has somehow escaped a demonic ritual, now branded for demonic sacrifice. It gives details on how the game's played, and is a very general D20 versus DC style D20 system. Advantage and disadvantage mechanics are included, as per modern D20, and then there's the idea of both critical failures and successes, which can be applied outside of combat as well as just on any roll, and may be used to introduce complexity into a scenario. There's rules for opposed checks as well before the character creation part starts. Character creation in Sacrifice uses the typical D20 6 stats of Strength, Intelligence, Wisdom, Dexterity, Constitution, and Charisma, with base generation system of 3d6, assign as you wish. There's only humans as the playable types, and rather than a character class, you get 3 feats and a few weapon and armor proficiencies, as well as a combat maneuver to start with. Characters start at level 3 to represent their experience before being marked. There's some simple explanation about the 6 ability scores, although it's pretty typical of D20 systems and retro clones in general, and Sacrifice uses a BX and Beckney style bonus penalty curve, so again, pretty typical. Where it starts to vary is the special skills and feats, which replace classes. Rather than a class, you pick 1 permanent bonus to an ability score, and then all characters get a few abilities that are universal to branded individuals. These are a mix of supernatural sensitivity deriving from the Mark of Sacrifice itself, a game mechanic affecting materials such as the ability to sacrifice Constitution to get up from 0 hit points, even a luck expenditure ability, and mastery dice that can be used to damage entire crowds of opponents automatically. Character advancement comes next, and since there's no classes, all characters use the same experience chart, hit die accrual, and feat and skill point accumulation. As far as skills go, each skill has its associated ability score, and these generally follow the same list that 5th edition has, although there are a few variations and additions. Adding a skill point gives a bonus to that skill, and initially you add a point to 3 different skills, although later that can be improved even further. You can also be proficient in a skill, which gives advantage to checks when using it. With weapons and armor, you simply get disadvantage while using weapons you aren't proficient in, and with certain checks when using armor you aren't proficient in. Feats are a combination of feats and what might be class traits in other systems. New characters get 3, then you get additional feats over time, and they can cover everything from flat bonuses to special attacks, and even borderline supernatural abilities, like doing extra damage against monsters and demons or healing more swiftly. Combat maneuvers are something all characters have as well, and grant the ability to use some sort of special attack at a cost of stamina. Rather than a flat amount that stays static, stamina is determined randomly at the start of each combat, and then may be expended during combat to use these abilities. Finally, as a character kills certain unnatural creatures, their weapon accumulates energy, which can give it a bonus after a certain number of energy fragments have been gathered, with starting characters getting to choose one of their weapons to receive a random number of these fragments. Character creation finishes with some pretty typical things, determining hit points, armor class, initiative, then determining flaws and what initially drew them to the Inquisition, from which they have now been cast out. They also get to determine what has happened to them since the event that marked them, including where the mark is and any existing wounds and permanent scars. The gear section is much like any other OSR game, starting with a coinage system. The value of gold has been drastically increased, with most of the actual economy of the game relying on silver and lesser coins, such as copper and brass. There is an encumbrance system that is abstracted into items versus a number based on strength, which is actually pretty common now in OSR systems, at least in its various, variations. I kind of like it, honestly. Similarly, there's a usage die system for certain expendable items, such as ammo and like, where using an item calls for the roll of a die, and then that die is of a certain number. It reduces the die by a stage until you get to 0. The tables that follow are pretty straightforward, showing cost, weight, damage, and any special properties of individual weapons, with the special properties being very similar to 5th edition material, although they are described for those who are not familiar with them. Armor is then similarly described, with some armor requiring certain levels of strength to use effectively. The gear section wraps up with a brief table of other adventuring gear. It's not super comprehensive, but with more of the critical objects that you would expect in a dungeoneering or even a typical expedition over land having been covered. The next major section, Rules, comes up next and dives right into the core mechanic on skill checks, which is the standard D20 plus modifier versus a DC number. Ability checks, however, use a more old-school style check of 3d6 versus the character's ability score. I find it a little bit odd to mix the checks like that, but whatever works, I guess. Saving throws are based on categories similar to OSR systems, with 4 major categories. You have paralysis, poison and death, blast and breath, and fear, charm, and sleep. Each category of creatures, humans, including PCs, beasts, and then demons and monsters, has their own base values for saves. The combat rules use a very simple step-by-step formula, with initiative rolled before each round, and each character able to move and then perform one action. The basic attack roll is the same as in any D20 system, really, with D20 plus appropriate mods versus the target's AC. There is an explanation of how to make a surprise check as well as the initiative check before various common options for the combat action are listed, from a standard attack to feat and maneuver use, etc. There is some consideration for a PC getting an additional attack at higher levels. Basic things to keep in mind, such as unarmed attacks, ranged attack limitations, and dual-wielding rules are given before the critical hit and fumble tables are gone over. Critical hits are divided by weapon type, and there's an entry given for bombs and spell effects as well, with each offering a table of increasingly damaging effects, usually including at least one potential instant kill effect. Morale rules are covered to give an indication as to when an NPC or enemy may retreat or surrender, as well as giving an idea of just what sort of retreat or surrender might be taken. and then the healing and death rules are given. Sacrifice splits the difference between hardcore OSR systems and more modern ones, with characters getting a healing rate expressed as a die based on their maximum hit points, and heal according to that. It's somewhat more generous than your standard OSR system without being the whole rest and recover everything of modern 5th edition versions. Being reduced to 0 hit points is also not a guarantee of death. Rather, this system uses the increasingly more common idea of waiting to check on a character's status until they are checked on after combat, with a roll modified by the type of treatment they receive, the time since they were taken down, and so forth, determining whether a character is dead, possibly severely wounded, or readily brought back. This may even result in permanent wounds if they barely survive, which is given in its own table. Fatigue is detailed after the healing system and is very similar to the 5th edition exhaustion rules, with a few modifications. Considering the setting overall, it is a bit more important to have this one covered up front. Travel procedures follow, with rules for weather and how to use the 3 phases of travel to either move, camp, explore, forage, and so forth, making for a very hexcrawl-friendly system. There is a chance to mess up while setting up camp, which can have ill effects for the next day. There's also rules for orienteering, aka avoiding getting lost, and general travel mishaps that can result in events or injury during travel. General encounter tables are given that can be applied pretty much anywhere through the no man's land area. The corruption rules that follow give guidelines and rules for encountering and accruing corruption. The idea is that certain areas and creatures, as well as actions, give corruption to a character just by encountering them or performing them. When this corruption reaches a certain threshold, they trigger a corruption effect from the table, which can permanently mutate a character before resetting the corruption counter to the beginning to start again. I think I've seen variations of this going all the way back to almost like the Ravenloft era. The rules section in general then concludes with guidelines for awarding experience. Interestingly, it is for more than just killing creatures. You get experience for succeeding at checks that the GM calls for critically hitting things, and so forth. The world is the next major section and describes the continent of Nea and its history and the setting, as well as relevant portions for play. I am not going to go into this in detail, but I will mention that it covers the history of the last few empires, includes various encounters one might run into while traveling the realm, and details areas within the kingdoms involved in the conflict around No Man's Land. The Kingdom of Pravaria and Cadenar Dominion, which have been going back and forth over the area for about 100 years. Each is described in brief with relevant places of interest and notable details. The Church of the Burning Light is described as well as its doctrines, since it plays a largely antagonistic role, although it can be somewhat helpful sometimes. It has a very witch hunter sort of mindset, so be aware. A few of the various orders within the hierarchy are also described. The section goes on to detail the threat of the demonic, which basically involves the fact that the war that's been going on so long has been a draw for dark creatures. Then the history of the war itself has been touched on. There's a random mercenary band name table given, since mercenaries are such a common sight, and then the areas of No Man's Land where the default setting actually takes place are detailed, including the major towns, complete with a map of the area. Actually exploring No Man's Land has randomly determined hex civilization levels, since at any one moment an area can be rendered to wilderness or battlefield by the vagaries of war, and random minor settlements can pop up or fade away as battles dictate. There's tables for encounters and the various hexes based on type, as well as tables to expand on those encounters and their details. The section finishes up with tables to generate random area-wide effects, or events, such as the sample adventure seeds to get things going if the party is stalling. Finally, there's some treasure tables, although most treasures are fairly low-key, and consist primarily of trinkets and a few valuable items here and there. Although there are, in fact, rules for a masterwork, weapon, or armor given, as well as a precious few magical artifacts. Each of these magical artifacts has a cost associated with using it, so do beware. The final section of the book is the Bestiary. Creatures detailed therein generally have a block of stats offering a number appearing, morale, hit dice, AC, movement, passive perception, number of attacks and damage, as well as the experience given as a flat number, plus a number of bonus experience per individual hit point, similar to the 1st edition era style monsters. This is followed by a very general description of the creature and any special abilities that they may have. All of this is pretty standard, except that due to the setting there's some things to note. First is that some encounter tables give a chance that in an encounter normal animal or person is possessed by evil spirits. This is handled by a sort of template that can be applied to any creature so listed. The second thing of note is the existence of an Apostles class of creature. Rather than random individuals, each of these is unique and fairly powerful, being a human who has become a demon through various sacrifices and vile deeds. Those familiar with Berserk will be well familiar with this sort of creature. There's only a couple listed in the Bestiary, and they are powerful and unique, but they are doubtless not the only such creatures, and can provide a model for design of further Apostles. After the Bestiary, the book closes with a character sheet, and then the general slew of legal information. So, Sacrifice. In terms of how it's put together, it's decently edited, as I mentioned before, and it's written well and easy to follow. I appreciate how easy the rules section is to jump around in and really figure out where you're at. There's little to no searching for obscure rules. It's all there where I feel like it should be. I mean, that may just be me, if it exists at all, because there are some rules that are a little bit too complex for this sort of system. The illustrations are a bit on the appropriately spooky side and are very reminiscent of the Berserk manga in the scenes that they portray, even if the styles are different. In terms of the system itself, it treads the line almost perfectly between that OSR simplicity with modern flourishes that make it simple to customize a character without the use of classes, although the range of abilities, feats, and other combat maneuvers means that you're really going to mostly be creating various martial-style characters. Even though there are some borderline supernatural feats, the lack of a magic system within the base rules means that there's no real way to duplicate someone like Shirke, and that is a damn shame. I do like that the advancement system starts at level 1, even though the branded starts at level 3, and that the branded supernatural ability is given its own entry. This theoretically makes it possible to create a mixed group of marked and unmarked characters, with some starting at level 1 and some at level 3, or, if you want, to start a group of unmarked characters and then have them encounter the event that eventually marks them at the appropriate level. The permanent injury, corruption, and various crit tables mean that the characters may eventually end up with many permanent marks, scars, and such, although most of the penalties are actually rather manageable. This keeps it from really feeling like a constant downward spiral, while still encouraging characters to avoid combat when they can. The ability to get experience from skill checks can reinforce this, since a character might be able to gain experience from sneaking around or avoiding certain minor encounters and only really dealing with the major ones. So in terms of the system as a whole, I find it very fitting and fast to play. Oddly enough, I run a Dark Fantasy 5th edition game that also has Berserk as one of its primary inspirations, and a few of the elements of Sacrifice are extremely similar to alternate rules I'd either already been using or come up with, so obviously I'm going to appreciate those. And hey, it gives me even more ideas to borrow for that campaign. I especially like that magic items are not your standard array, but are instead artifacts that each have their own trade-offs for use. As far as the setting and the basic conceit of the game, I am a little disappointed that it's assumed you're playing former Inquisitors, although it wouldn't exactly take a lot of work to come up with some character background information for non-Inquisitors. The world is well enough designed, providing a war-torn countryside that does seem like it fit right in with the inspiration material, and yet is unique enough to feel like its own thing. It does help Sacrifice stand out just a little, although with existence of the Apostles and the spirit-possessed encounters, the game really wears its primary inspiration right on its sleeve. There are way worse things to be borrowing so heavily from. All in all, Sacrifice is one of the better semi-OSR offerings that I've seen for this particular niche. Although there's enough meat on the bones, so to speak, to run games in other genres as well, other systems will tend to do those with less adaptation. Sacrifice is designed to do one thing: a dark fantasy, brutal sort of setting with heavy demonic influence. But what it does extremely well. And hey, as I said, if you're going to lean this heavily into being inspired by something, there are way worse things to be inspired by than Berserk. So, please, can we have a magic system supplement just so we get that little witch in action, kind of, But for now, this has been the RPG Crawler with my look at Sacrifice from Black Oath Entertainment. As always, I will put a link to where you can get it below. If you like what you've seen, remember to leave a like, comment, got any feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content. Until next time, take care and goodbye. And if you are still watching, I would like to take the opportunity to thank my supporters, the top tiers of which are listed on the screen, without whose support I would not have been able to offer the variety of content that I have on this channel throughout the years. If you're feeling particularly generous and would like to join them, you can support the channel. There are a variety of options to do so. I have a Patreon, a Subscribe Star, as well as channel memberships enabled. If you are not in a position to contribute, simply leaving a like, a comment, or sharing my videos are all wonderful ways to help the channel grow without spending a dime, and are all greatly appreciated.